have an unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Nathan Hamlin, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Greetings and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, or chaps, should I say, as my co-host would tell you as how they speak in their country. You are listening to the one and only Dr. J Radio Live, the truly syndicated international show that speaks about the truth to the people, literally to all of you, direct to you. And we are in syndication with, of course, PSN Radio, Late Night in the Midlands, and thanks to Johnny Webb, who I'm pre-introducing, Deprogram Radio and Pulse Talk Radio Network in the United Kingdom. Not to mention, everybody can, of course, go to iTunes, tunein.com, Shoutcast, and several other forms. Even YouTube, folks. Now, while I introduce the show, I always stall because I want you guys to go and check out, guys and gals, to check out our guest by looking at any of the social media channels that you go to. And a new one, thanks to my co-host, minds.com. Again, you can go to the website. Everything is the name of the show, Dr. J Radio Live. So if you want to go to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, Slack, YouTube, where it's archived, streamed as well, with, of course, a really cool slideshow, not to mention, just everything under the sun is under that one phrase. Now, I am broadcasting in the City of Angels, where usually it's what they say, sunny California. But today, gray skies and some rain, which my guest would say the rain is much more common his way because he is in the same great state of California. And that is a little past 7 p.m. Pacific time for those folks on the East Coast of the U.S. It is 10:02 p.m. Eastern time, and we're Johnny Webb, my co-host, live in a studio in London, England, United Kingdom, 3 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Johnny Webb, thank you for staying up so late, brother.
You're welcome, sir. It's, I must say, it's a chilly morning here.
Well, I hope we have one this morning, too, here. But it looks to be turning that way because the day was gray, and sure enough, the rain started falling. Now, let me give you a couple pieces of news while you still, all you folks, please check out all the media, social media, to see who our guest is, unless you've already been paying attention and you know exactly who it is, because it's going to be a fantastic show. This is one of the guests that I get so many requests to have on regularly. I wish I could have him on, once a week, but I don't think he's available that time, but that's the popularity of this gentleman. And remember, this is among politicians, celebrities, researchers, you name it. Even the director of the Astrophysics Institute at Harvard, right? Even the popularity of him does not parallel the man today. So here's a couple pieces of news. First of all, as you know, I told you this is an international show, and yesterday I was saying we were at 43 countries. Well, I did have a spare hour today, so I happened to look at some new emails, which were some questions, requests, and comments, stuff like that. And we have our 44th, 45th, and 46th countries, which are Finland, French Congo, and Argentina. Thank you, folks. Literally, you are tuning in to hear what you're not going to hear usually on Fox News or CNN. Now, here's another small piece of trivia, everybody. Why is Trump, I can't tell you, it's pretty obvious. Why is he going on a thank you tour? Because he probably didn't think he was going to win. But nonetheless, why was Hershey, Pennsylvania, where he spoke just a few hours ago, named Hershey? Well, if you've been living under a rock, Obviously, it was because, this is, just Google it. The point was, it was built as a town to accommodate all the people who would work for the candy company, Hershey's. And so they had a Ferris wheel, they had doctor, barber, theater, you name it, everything to accommodate families. And it's obviously blown up. And this is also ironic. You have our President-elect Trump, which never in my life have I seen someone do so much between election and inauguration as he's done publicly. And it's just sort of ironic when you think about, you have the CEO of the Trump organization is now going to be the CEO of the U.S. What a way to say it, huh? So now I've given you enough news. Now let's bring on our fabulous guest. He has done so much in his life. One of the hallmarks was, of course, when he was in the United States Army, and he taught at the JFK School of Warfare Psyops, or Psychological Warfare Division, and has done so much more since then, and of course before then. He is a retired lieutenant colonel and a doctorate, PhD, a doctorate from my alma mater of all. And then think about that. That is a lot of accomplishments under the sun to have for this one gentleman. So, without further ado, let's bring on the one and only Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Michael Aquino. Dr. Aquino, welcome back.
Thank you for that kind mention, and I'm very pleased to be here.
It's not, I'm just speaking the truth, literally, just the truth, and this is coming from people globally who have read your books. And I'm happy to say that the other book, which we're going to talk about, Mind Stars, what we're going to start on, which was published, I believe, last year, 2015. You can yes. But before that, you had a manuscript that was just circulating among intelligence communities, and then you finally published into a book, Mind War, which I thought was so fabulous that I asked you if I can get a copy to place it into some key hands. So, I'm happy to say it is in the hands of Michael Dukakis, former Defense Minister of Canada, the Honorable Paul Hellyer, and Nick Pope from the UK MOD. And I wouldn't be surprised if Israeli Mossad and everybody else is reading it, because this is something that not only can change the way a country can live macroly and go forward as far as growth, it could actually change people on a micro scale. So let's go wind back the clock to Mind War and tell us how you got from Mind War to Mind Star. Just give people who are hearing you for the first time, especially since we have the newest network, Pulse Talk Radio in UK, that just started picking up the shows, that you're the first time live on them. So what basically, I know what it is. What do you, the name implies what it is, but why don't you give a description of Mind War?
Well, the story of Mind War actually goes back to when I was still a ROTC cadet at our alma mater, UC Santa Barbara, and I was planning on a military career, probably in the field of military intelligence, with my political science major giving me a head start there. But one thing troubled me, which was that the military is obviously in the business of conducting foreign policy such as it is by beating other people's brains out, by shooting them and blowing them up. And that didn't sound to me to be a very positive way of dealing with things if we are such an intelligent species that we can send people to the moon and so on. So I ran into, at that time, looking around the Army to see what career fields might be available, I ran into a then rather obscure aspect of the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg called Psychological Operations. This has to do probably most easily understood as propaganda, the kind that's delivered on the battlefield, such as leaflets and loudspeaker messages to get the other army demoralized and suggest that it should surrender. It's also used against neutral audiences, such as host country civilian areas, to get the people to cooperate with you rather than to become combative with you. So this was pretty much the extent of U.S. Army psychological operations, or PSYOP, at that time. I did go into that career field and spent my time in Southeast Asia in the next few years in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia with U.S. PSYOP efforts, which had to do both with the military side of things and with the civilian side of things, which was generally under the aegis of CORDS, the branch of the Central Intelligence Agency that announced itself over there, since the CIA wasn't officially supposed to be there at the time. So later on, in the 1970s, when I was back in the United States and assigned as a research and development officer to the 7th PSYOP group in San Francisco, I was asked by its commander, who was a full colonel by the name of Paul Vallely, to do a post-mortem on the PSYOP effort in Vietnam and figure out why it hadn't worked. Because, as you know, the war was generally a failure over there for us. It didn't work for us, and it not only failed in terms of the old adage of winning hearts and minds, but of course it failed militarily and blew up. It's a matter of conjecture today to look back on it and say who won, since after all this time we now have Burger Kings and McDonald's in Hanoi. Yeah. So maybe we did win in the long run. But that being as it may, I did some research, and what I found took me not only into the libraries of the Army's PSYOP headquarters at Fort Bragg, but quite a way beyond that, into the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and even some foreign information and foreign intelligence that, very interestingly, I was able to get from a much more thorough source than either the CIA or State Department, which was Michael Murphy, of one of the founders of the Esalen Institute down here on the West Coast, which is a sort of a touchy-feely, get in touch with your inner self kind of relaxation place down in Big Sur, which is still functional today. So Michael Murphy wrote a book called An End to Ordinary History, in which he discussed Russian research into the psyche and into the esoteric areas of PSYOP, and he presented it as a novel. But I read that book and I said, you know, there's a little bit more to this than meets the eye. So I wrote to Murphy. He got back to me and introduced me to a gentleman named Steve Donovan, who was an associate of his here in San Francisco, who had been back and forth to the Soviet Union extensively during the 60s and 70s and had collected a massive, massive library of Russian research into psi and in the functioning of the human mind and extrasensory perception and all that. I mean, rooms and rooms of this stuff, whereas the CIA might have one file cabinet and Steve Donovan had 20. So I was a little bit, I went sort of crazy. He said, just help yourself. So I did, so I did an enormous amount of research running it back and forth to Steve Donovan's place here in San Francisco, and the result was to come up with the realization of exactly why U.S. PSYOP had not worked. And it is actually, it's both complex and simple. But to put it at its most simple, you think that you are in control of your thoughts. by your conscious decisions. In other words, you take in information and you make up your mind based on the information that you take in, and then you go do things with it. This is what's called algorithmic thinking, meaning conscious level of thinking.
Yes.
But what I discovered through all this research is that that kind of thinking actually accounts for only about 5% of our mental activity, and the other 95% is at the subconscious level and is generally called pattern thinking, which means that you're gathering information all the time by your five senses, and that information goes into the construction of patterns of reality. These are the things that you judge. You take your conscious thoughts and you sort of apply these against your pattern of reality to see where they fit or not. And if they don't fit, you disregard them or select them out. But if they do, then they're reinforced in your belief as truth, and you go on from there. So this 95% of stuff that's going into our brains to construct these patterns comes through all of our senses, through hearing, through sight, through a lot of completely subconscious things like brain waves that are being entrained from external waves that are going on, through magnetism, through various electrical forces, through gravitational forces, even through subconscious perceptions of different kind of colors that have nothing to do with whether or not you like consciously a particular color or not. So what I began to realize is that there's a large ocean of material going into all of our bodies that is, for the most part, randomized. It's haphazard. Nobody's controlling this.
And untapped if you're not controlling it, because
yes,
essentially
yes,
you're not making use of it, right?
So you're basically enslaved to what you're getting in through the unconscious sensory inputs to your brain. And you are under the illusion, with that remaining 5% of your consciousness, that you're making, purely discretionary decisions when you're not. You're actually filling in the blanks, and you're kind of bringing in your ongoing sensory impressions to a reality pattern that you have already decided either validates or discards the stuff that you're currently getting in. So the question then is, well, are we simply pissing up wind then if all we do is construct arguments to that 5%? We should be spending some time looking at that 95% and seeing, is this helping us as a species, or is it doing bad things? Is it creating sort of monsters of the id, like that creature in Forbidden Planet that turns human beings into sort of negative, suspicious, and combative life forms that efforts to make us behave decently just have no chance to control, because there's so much under the surface, like that monster in the movie, that we just kept being buffeted around by it. And what I came up with was, no, we actually have a lot of technologies that we can use to influence all of those factors that come in and generate these reality patterns. And I wrote at the time, I wrote only a very tentative paper for Colonel Valley about this that just touched on it, but I reared up back in 2013 and wrote a whole book on it and brought all this into quite a bit of detail, you might say excruciating detail. And that was the book Mind War, which I have also updated into a second edition this year, 2016. So the book Mind War was originally written to circulate within the decision-making elements and policy elements of the U.S. government. The more I went with it, the more I said to myself, everybody should be aware of this shit. And then, not only does that inform our government people about it, but it also lets the government people know that we all know about this stuff, so that we're looking over their shoulder at what they're doing. And we can also make some intelligent suggestions, not to mention the fact that our own academic institutions, such as our universities, can start paying attention to this and maybe raise it to an even higher level of precision than I'm able to, working in Steve Donovan's basement here.
It gives me the idea that the government sort of doesn't want us to know, because then that would take away that secret weapon. And
the government, yes,
no.
the government has a green door fixation on classified information, and I've always respected classified information, and I've held a clearance up to above the top secret level, to levels that themselves are classified, so I can't even mention them. But they're at the compartment, what you call Special Intelligence Access, or SIA level. And I've held these through my lifetime, and I've always disliked them because, first of all, they're very hard to work with because you never know who you can talk to unless you check out their clearances, too, and make sure that they're cleared to hear what you have to say and vice versa. So the channels that you can use to communicate are very constrained and constricted. But also because there's a lot of information that's out there, and if you limit yourself or you prioritize the stuff that somebody decided to classify, you're immediately limiting, the scope of raw material that you have to work with. I could cite, many classified files at the very high levels that profess to have a very definitive account of some human activity. Then I could go on the internet and find dozens of sites that have a much more advanced look into it, but that people don't spend much time with because that's just the internet and it's all bullshit. But if this thing was anointed by having a classification that high, then presumably it's right next to God. Well, that's just not the case. So, to make a long story short, I've always disliked working with classified information, and when I could, both out in the field in Psyop and later on in my own research, I deliberately went in the direction of keeping everything that I did non-classified so that I could share it with everybody and nobody would go to jail, including me.
Yes, yes.
And the other aspect of that, of course, is that not only can you talk freely about this stuff, but I can share this information not just with hot people in government, but with the average American slob, who just might be an intelligent American slob or some slob in another country. I've had a lot of people from other countries show an interest in the Mind War book, too. And that's fine with me, because the more we all understand this stuff and the less we're scrabbling around in the dark dealing with these id monsters that turn us into monsters instead of intelligent people. So that was the whole idea behind Mind War. And the other thing I can tell you about it in 2016 with its second edition is that the publisher that I used makes books much more expensive if they're done in color than if they're in black and white. So I switched the second edition to black and white and brought the price way, way down. And it's also available, of course, in an electronic Kindle version. So I made it much more accessible to those of us, on tight budgets these days. So that's what I wanted to say also, is that all of these devices that I mentioned earlier, by which you can influence the construction of patterns and the way that they come together, I grouped together in the book under the heading of Psycon, P-S-Y-C-O-N, meaning psychological control mechanisms. This sounds very spooky and science fiction-y, but it's actually very straightforward, and it just says, if you understand that these are the mechanisms that dictate your unconscious thoughts and how they come together, and these are the way that you can adjust those and control them and make sure that you aren't simply being blindsided by them, then an intelligent approach to getting your mind at its most enlightened has to do with putting these things all together in an intelligent way and applying all these psychons not just to an enemy but to yourself, so that we all together become more reasonable, more proactive, more positive and able to solve problems cooperatively rather than just simply beating each other's brains out. So that was, in a nutshell, the whole point of the Mind War book, and I'm happy to say that it's still going on. A copy of it went to Donald Trump.
Nice.
It's also known to some of his other senior advisors who've had contact in this field before. General Flynn, when he was director of DIA, has certainly encountered this stuff, and he's aware of it too. Now, exactly
what about the other
how...
Mad Dog Battis?
Oh, Mad Dog?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know, because it certainly has gotten all the way up into the top levels of the Army in the Pentagon. I haven't really paid that much attention to the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps, and I say this with complete respect for the Marines, they tend to be very much of the old school in terms of let's beat the other guy's brains out.
Yes.
That's the Marine way of thinking.
And shoot them down and blow them up,
yeah.
Right?
That's the Marine Corps way of thinking. They and it's been that way throughout their history. So it takes a little longer to tell the other evening I was at a function of a club here in San Francisco that's composed of retired senior officers of the American and British armed forces, and our guest speaker was a Marine colonel who was one of the top people who had just come back from the situation in Iraq, and he was giving us an update there, and I was chatting with him, and I said, I guess it figures that if we were going to have a Marine general in the Pentagon like this guy, that his nickname would be Mad Dog and not Fluffy Bunny.
Exactly.
And he gave me this glacial look, and he said, we get rid of all the fluffy bunnies as lieutenants. So
that's a good way to describe it.
That's the Marine Corps for you. Anyway, the Marine Corps will probably come around too, because they're not stupid. They just are in the habit of being the meanest motherfuckers in the valley, if you know what I mean. That's their creed, so to speak.
Absolutely. I have two things I want to bring up, but I know Johnny wanted to bring something up that you mentioned early on in your career in Southeast Asia. Go ahead, Johnny.
Yes, sorry guys. Good evening to you, Mr. Aquino. There's a couple of questions, but they've been coming in vigorously, and so I thought I'd better ask them while we've got you live as the horse's mouth, as they say. The first one came in from
That's
Justin.
The best end of the horse. Some people compare me to the other end of the horse.
I'm sorry, say that again?
They said that's the best end of the horse. Other people compare me to the other end.
Okay, well, we've got a few Facebook questions coming in. If they are from around the world. The first one's from Justin in Tunbridge in England. And he asks, Julian Assange, what does Mr. Aquino, what do you think he may be now? He's gone missing from the Ecuadorian embassy in London. That was from Justin. The second question is from Lewis in Madrid in Spain. He asks, being a former member of the Church of Set, what do you know of spirit cooking, and have you ever been invited, and if so, could you tell us about the event? And the last question was from Polly in Manchester, and she asked, Michael, what are your thoughts on the current events with Pizzagate and Max Spears, but preferably what's your point on the Pizzagate situation?
Okay, so let's see. Let me go back to those. Julian Assange, I've never met Julian Assange or had any contact with him or WikiLeaks. And on one hand, I'm not really a fan of what I would call random release of classified information that's legitimately classified, because you can do a lot of damage that way. For example, suppose you have a set of instructions on how to build a nuclear bomb.
Yes.
And that set of instructions is leaked, and then it's leaked out to the public, and then any jackass can go into his basement with a chemistry set and build one. Well, that's not a very smart thing.
Right? Yeah.
Yes, sure. So I'm not really all that thrilled about uncontrolled release of classified information. I do think that, of course, there's a lot of information that is classified that either doesn't need to be or shouldn't be. And I particularly don't like it when classification is used to cover up embarrassing things or things that might fall under the heading of war crimes or stuff like that. So, it's sort of a mixed bag. I don't, I'm not sure exactly if it were my decision what I would do with Julian Assange, but I don't think I would want to persecute him or hound him. I would want to kind of get into a room with him, sit down with him, have a discussion with him about what he thinks he's doing and why he thinks it's good, and see if we can kind of reach a consensus that makes good sense as to what kind of controls he and his organization put on things. Because as I understand it from the interviews with him that I've heard, he doesn't just release willy-nilly everything that comes across his desk with WikiLeaks. They do exercise some judgment and try to keep damaging stuff out, but they just want to get the sort of the dirty linen that has no business being classified out there. And I personally understand that very well.
And like
as
you
far
said
as
earlier, so many things are stamped under the national security guise that you could find several reasons to take the smallest thing, anything in your house, and say, okay, oh wait, this has some national security concerns. Okay, it's classified, and therefore, by using that method, you're taking so many things out of public view that what kind of world are we really living in?
Sure, and the phrase national security has become a very sloppy one. I think if you asked two different people for their definition of it, you'd come up with two different definitions.
Or three, yeah.
Does it mean that we should try to lock, our country or Britain or whatever the country is into the exact same mold that it is right now on a permanent basis without any kind of evolution? If that's what you're talking about, then obviously national security means national stagnation. If national security means that you're taking care to deny other people the ability, like terrorists, to build a nuclear bomb, then obviously that's a valid use of it. But as you can see, there's a long gray area between the two, which would take us hours, if we went into all that right now. So in any case, I don't think that Julian Assange is necessarily a demon or a bad person. I'm very unhappy with the way that he's sort of being treated, with everybody poised to arrest him and hang him at dawn and things like this. I don't think that's the intelligent way to deal with somebody who seems to be motivated towards getting good information out for everybody to look at in the open. Question number two, I think, had to do with, question number two and sort of three sort of blended in together, I think. They were asking about, somebody asked about what was called the Church of Set. Well, the name of the organization is actually the Temple of Set, and it's an international religion. It's been around since 1975, and it's the evolved successor to an organization that was around in the United States 10 years before that, called the Church of Satan, which was founded by Anton LaVey. The Church of Satan started out as a sort of a social criticism of what Anton considered to be the hypocrisy of organized religion in the 1960s. And it also had an aspect of his interest in the black arts, black magic, sorcery, that kind of thing. So it had both a social aspect and a kind of a research metaphysical aspect to it. And in 1975, to make a long story short, it sort of came up against the limitations of being trapped within Judeo-Christianity as a frame of reference, since the world is a lot bigger than that. And indeed, the universe is a lot bigger than all conventional religions, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, etc. So the Temple of Set took this quest far out and far beyond the limitations of that idiom, and ultimately to what we consider to be, and still do, its most advanced laboratory, which was that of ancient Egypt, which would take me several more hours to go into. But in any case, the Temple of Set is an Egyptian metaphysical institution, and it draws very heavily on what would later be sort of made intelligible to modern thinking as the Pythagorean system and Platonism. And that is sort of in a nutshell, where we are and what we think about that. The Pizzagate thing that somebody also inquired about had to do, I think, with a news story. Had a news story that Hillary Clinton was somehow involved with a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., which was a front for child sexual abuse activities, and it excited some idiot enough to go there and take a couple of shots with a rifle at it, which got it into the news. And as it turned out, it was very quickly discredited as a complete fabrication. And that is that's all that, as far as I gathered from the thing, except that somebody called my attention and said, "Hey, did you know that you got mentioned, on YouTube about this?" And he gave me a URL, and I took a look. It said Hillary Clinton the Clintons were involved with, and Podesta, were involved in this thing called spirit writing, in which you take blood from some animal and write it on the wall, I guess, and that's supposed to communicate something to you spiritually. And this all goes back to the Clintons' involvement with this huge international conspiracy of black magic and devil worship controlled by Michael Aquino. And I said, "What?" This is news to me. And of course, I've never even heard of that kind of spirit writing or what it is before then. I know that there was some animal sacrifice stuff that was involved in some rather low forms of ritualistic worship by voodoo, in the Caribbean and places like that. But certainly, we don't injure any animals in any way in the Temple of Set, nor did we in the Church of Satan. And the whole notion of spirit writing that way strikes me as just simple idiocy. So
Sorry,
I haven't thought any further of it beyond that. And I've never instructed the Clintons on anything. Thank you very much. Anything they've done, they can blame on themselves, but not on me.
Agreed. Johnny, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Yeah, sorry. Lewis was actually saying not spirit writing. He was mentioning also spirit cooking, which has also been in the media this last month, which involves effigies of humans that were sort of dissected and eaten in big parties. But when you look at it, it's not like a real person. It's a cake, from what I can see. And so you have celebrities that come together and they eat different parts of the cake. And I'm sure that if they want that centre bit, they pay a bit more in their, whatever offering they do to charity. But I just wondered, have you ever been invited to that yourself? And that was the question.
I've never even heard of that before now, and it strikes me again as completely nutty as a concept. I can't imagine anybody taking anything like that seriously. But what can I say? I think it was P.T. Barnum, the old circus fellow, who said nobody ever went broke by underestimating the intelligence of the public. And I guess when you say something like that, there are a certain number of people that will say, "Oh, wow, gosh, no, this is nuts. Forget it."
Agreed. And that's one thing that it's funny to say that when you actually talk to different people and they just hear a rumor and run with it. Not only do they so a rumor can put people behind bars. Even false testimony can send people to death row. Let me give you an example of how bad people's eyes can be. Okay, when I was in law school and I took a course in criminal procedure, there was a study we had done where while the professor was talking about something, somebody ran in there and grabbed her purse and ran out. So this was all staged. We found this out after. Then came the police and started interviewing everybody. So then after that, they bring in the guy, And everyone's blown away because no two people can get the same description. Black guy, white guy, hat, no hat, black jacket, red jacket, no jacket. I mean, it was just all around the world. I mean, just anything you can imagine. It was just funny how something like that. So you really can't depend on witness testimony, and for that, like you mentioned, rumors are starting. Now, one quick comment before I go back to wars and actually back to the subconscious. Speaking of animal blood, we had someone here who was a professor at a prestigious university who was a former member of the OTO, and prior to the show, he did some ritual magic involving beef blood. And I thought, oh wow, that's the first time I've actually spoken to somebody who's ever used something like that. So I just thought it was ironic and meant to brought up. Now, I'm going to go in reverse order. Rather than going back to a few years before you were born, or even a decade before you were born, I'm going to go to when you were in Southeast Asia. Can you tell us of course, what's not classified, what sort of psychological warfare was used against the people?
Well, sure. First of all, you're talking about different target audiences because you're in a multicultural and multi-tribal situation there, where you've got the lowland, sort of mainline Vietnamese. You've got a branch of them in the south. You've got the Chinese or Cochin Chinese, Indo-Chinese that are the Vietnamese up in the north, kind of towards the China border there in the North Vietnam area. You've got the Montagnards, sort of a hill tribal people, and then you've got various religions that are bouncing around. The Catholicism that was brought in by the French, when they were colonializing the place, and of course Buddhism, and various animistic worship patterns, that are going on among the Montagnards. So you're dealing with a very heterogeneous area there, and you have to not only figure out who you want to target and why, but then you have to do a sort of a detailed analysis, saying, well, what reaches them, in all this. Yeah. Incidentally, before I completely leave your former comment, I might mention that there were aspects. The OTO was nothing that had a direct connection with either the Church of Satan or Temple of Set.
Yes.
The OTO still exists today, but that's largely the product of Aleister Crowley, and came out of his experiences before then with the Golden Dawn. But the OTO itself was a construct of German Templarism, meaning a sort of a rogue branch of the Masonic institutions of Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And they did have some ceremonies in which they used a little animal blood, I believe. Not so much in terms of direct sacrifices, just taking animal blood and using it to construct things to eat, like cakes of light, as Crowley referred to them, and so on, in which he also used semen, depending upon how intensive your appetite is here.
I know, right?
But, yeah. So that's kind of the OTO side of things, and the OTO is a legitimate organization today, but it also gave birth to a variety of spin-offs itself, such as the well-known AMORC Rosicrucians, who got their original charter from Theodore Roos, who was at that time head and founder of the German OTO. The Rosicrucians don't quite like to mention that. It's sort of a piece of their history that they just assume people don't know, but that's where they originally got their, charter and their legitimacy in 1915. I don't think they do much with regard to OTO stuff these days. They're in more of the fluffy bunny side of things.
And
anyway,
of the OTO, it stands for Order Templi Orientis, for those who don't know, because that professor had literally, he didn't even leave the organization. He just didn't pay his dues for, I think, a year or something like that. He was still an active member of the OTO when he was on this show.
Yeah, well, there's even some hidden information and all that, because the name is Ordo Templi Orientis, meaning the order of the Eastern Temple, which, without shocking your audience too much, refers to the anus.
Ooh.
And we'll we'll drop that conversation right there.
Yeah, I agree. Well, let me take this.
Anyway, you were asking about the Vietnam and the themes there. Yes. Okay. So it depended on who we were trying to communicate to do what. And remember that with regard to, say, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese soldiers, we were trying to get them to stop shooting at us, and the North Vietnamese to go home. And in case of the civilian population, we were just trying to convince them to not be combative, but to sort of just be, pacified and non-combative where we could. So when we were talking to civilians, we just emphasized themes like civil construction and land reallocation, and the building of schools and medical care and inoculations and hospitals and all those kinds of positive things. And when we were talking to enemy soldiers, the themes were more along the line of you really are fighting a much superior force here, who, the odds of your going home are very small, because you're up against a lot of military machinery that the more it can find you, it's pretty much going to destroy you. And it also had to do with aspects of that prospect of death, that had to do with, say, elements of Buddhism. For example, if you're a Buddhist and you die and your body is not properly treated and given a proper burial, then your soul or your spirit is sort of doomed to wander endlessly in a kind of a hellish nowhere land. And for that, we constructed an audio tape called Wandering Soul, which we would go up in a helicopter above cloud cover, so that you couldn't hear the rotor blades, but you hear this mysterious voice blasting down on you, professing to be the tortured soul of a North Vietnamese or Viet Cong soldier who'd been killed in battle and hadn't been given proper burial, and now was doomed to be tortured by monsters throughout all eternity. And Wandering Soul, which your listeners, if they're curious, they can just Google Wandering Soul, and you can find the audio tape of this on the internet and hear it for yourself. Because it's kind of interesting. We spent a lot of time in the laboratories of the State Department down in Saigon working this thing up, and it was something out of a Boris Karloff horror movie. But, kind of fun in that way. But the idea was, again, just to demoralize the enemy and suggest that they really, even if they got shot and killed, that wasn't going to be the end of their troubles, because this is what lay for them beyond that. And if you're a good little atheistic communist, you wouldn't necessarily believe that, but communism was a very thin overlay on the Vietnamese culture, which was generally Buddhist in orientation. And even their idea of Catholicism was very much, very towards the animistic side of things, rather than what you would normally think of Catholicism if you were in Italy or France.
And speaking of that, now I was going to go to literally the decade before the generation before yours, should I say, the rise of Adolf Hitler. He left World War I as a corporal. He was homeless. He couldn't get into an art school, and yet he tried to have this sort of takeover, right? And Hermann Goering was by his side, and so that got quashed by the German government. So Hitler ended up being sent to prison, where he wrote his famous book, Mein Kampf, or My Struggles. But somehow, I'm asking you, and he was obviously brilliant in the sense of propaganda, and how to get everybody, like you mentioned, the Nuremberg ceremonies from a previous show. But how did he rise to power to get people to not make an oath to Germany, but to him as the leader? You know, they didn't say, I swear my life to mother country Germany. No, it was, I swear to the Fuhrer. I mean, it is mind-boggling when you look at history and you see what happened.
Well, the situation by which the Nazis came to power was that they were dealing with a country that was coming apart at the seams at the time. The largest party in Germany at the time that the Nazis took power was actually the Communist Party, and the Weimar Republic system, which was sort of a very vanilla kind of approach to a Republican or democratic government, was simply unable to deal with these tremendous forces that were involved in street combat in Germany between the ultra-right and the ultra-left. And added to this was the Great Depression, in which you had runaway inflation in Germany, and you had a great number of people who were out of work, impoverished, and basically scared to death, from one day to the next. They were looking for the best person or group to protect them. And the Nazis professed to do that. We're going to take good care of you. We're going to organize the country and straighten it out. And the communists had more of a vague internationalist orientation, if you read the writings of Rosa Luxemburg and some of those theorists there. So they were sort of an extension of the international, Comintern and Cominform efforts that were going out of the Soviet Union, which didn't impress anybody as being a great success at that time either. It was also a pretty bloody mess over there.
Right.
So the communist alternative didn't look very good to the average German, and the Weimar Republic looked like it was a cesspool. And up came Adolf Hitler that said, "We're going to clean." What's Trump's expression? We're going to clean the swamp.
Clean the swamps, exactly.
We're going to clean the swamp here in Germany. We're going to get rid of all the people who are wrecking the situation for you, the honest working average German, and all you have to do is put me in charge. And he was easily the brightest star in the Nazi Party. He was very magnetic, very intelligent, very well read, much more so than anybody around him, and it just simply evolved into a personality cult around him. So that when he was appointed as chancellor, it sort of fell into a personality cult government at that point, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing that it makes decision-making really simple because it's a very linear channel of communication. But the bad thing is that if anything happens to that number one person, you're not left with a government that's very stable because it was all fixated on that one individual. Looking at, take a contrast of occultism, take a look at the Aleister Crowley organizations, which during Crowley's lifetime were all beholden to him.
OTO, right?
Yeah, well, he was a graduate of the Golden Dawn rather than its formation, a person who helped to form it. But he founded the AA, the Silver Star. He founded the British version of the OTO, and then gradually took over the OTO from its German roots. But after he died, then these things all fragmented and are very, very heterogeneous again at this point in time. So Nazi Germany was something that had a sort of a fixed, built-in automatic lifespan to it, which was Hitler's. And indeed, the moment that he committed suicide in 1945, the whole thing just collapsed, boom, like that. There was nothing to hold it together. So it didn't, even if it wanted to, it couldn't have survived his death that way. So what I'm getting at here is that he had a strong personal vision that he wanted to make Germany great again and get rid of all the factors in society that were holding it from being great.
And speaking of that, as you mentioned, cleaning the swamps out, which Trump says all the time, what was said during the campaign that for decades, going back to before the 90s, I guess mid to late 80s, that every single night when Donald Trump would go to sleep, by his bedside, he would read speeches that were said by Adolf Hitler. And I just thought that was bizarre. But then when you really think about it, well, if it worked for that guy, maybe it'll work for the new guy, right?
Well, I've never heard that before, and I suppose unless he says it himself.
Oh yeah, it's out there. It's not a conspiracy or a rumor. That's definitely true. Yeah, and it would make sense because of the success from the Nuremberg. I mean, obviously, you could say as a military officer, the campaign of the actual war was a failure, especially when you're trying to take over all of Europe, go eastward into the Soviet Union and North Africa at the same time. I think you're going to have a little bit of a problem being a little small country of, 70 million people? But and not to mention, if it's 70 million people, well, that includes children, women who do not wear uniforms and go out and fight like the men do. So what fraction of that do you have to actually go out and fight? So that's the part where a lot of people are up for debate. But it's definitely true that he has been reading his speeches that he gave throughout his highlights of his life before he died, and I guess, or not died. Some people say he sort of escaped Germany and not committed suicide. But either way, those final months, even though Germany, especially Berlin, was just getting shelled from England and I mean every corner of Europe was coming to that area of Germany. So you had to the north, you had France, and then the UK. Then you also had, of course, the Soviets who beat the US, and all of the above just trying to go take over. And he still thought he was going to win. I thought.
Well, I don't. First of all, I quite honestly can't speak to whether or not Donald Trump keeps Hitler's speeches by his bedside and has read them. It sounds apocryphal to me, but I honestly have no information on that one way or the other, and I've seen nothing in his personal speeches that use phrases or devices from Hitler's per se. But so I'm just kind of saying there that I would have to count myself out of endorsing that concept there. But as I have, for your listeners' information, shortly after Mind War came out, I kept getting people asking me, what about a real-world example of how Mind War might be applied? And I was originally going to I thought I might do a study of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, but that struck me as too easy and too simple. And then I took a look at the Mideast situation, and then I said to myself, no, if I started up on that one, I'd be working on it for 10 years.
And
that's
angry, right?
Such a mess, over there of things, and a huge jigsaw puzzle to disentangle. But then I said, you know what? Suppose I try to stop World War II in 1940 in Europe, because in my analysis of World War II, 1940 was about the last point where you could have used a mind war approach to it to actually bring it to a nonviolent halt and resolve things cooperatively and constructively. After that, it had simply deteriorated to the point where it entered that bloodthirsty conflagration, that you just referred to a few minutes ago. So I wrote a novelization, a mind war novel, you might say, of an alternate history, which I title "We Break the Sword," which is available for people who look on my Amazon page again there. And it is the story of how all the primary people who were involved in World War II at that time, Hitler, Stalin, Roosevelt, Churchill, and all the rest of them, reached a cooperative solution in 1940 to abort the war at that point and reach a very constructive and positive alternative. So We Break the Sword is an alternative history with a mind war flavor. And I have to confess, I had some fun in there because I brought in some concepts like ancient Atlantis and the Philadelphia experiment and the bell and so on, just to make sure that the reader didn't get bored, from chapter to chapter. But it kind of amused me the other day to see that right now, apparently there is a dramatization on Amazon's own streaming thing of a novel called The Man in the High Tower, which is apparently somebody else's story of World War II that was won by the Nazis and the Japanese who occupied the United States at that point. So it's a sort of a nasty fantasy of an occupied United States by these two vicious foreign powers. And I was thinking to myself, how different that is from We Break the Sword, in which case all of this bad feeling and all of this destructiveness and nastiness is simply vaporized in 1940 and turned constructive. So for anybody who is at all curious about that and who may be watching that series called The Man in the High Tower, I'd also put in a recommendation here that you take a look at We Break the Sword and see how World War II might have developed if mind war had been applied to it in 1940. I think you'll have a very interesting time.
It's very interesting. It's Jonathan again. I've got another question coming in on Facebook. It comes from Pat in Dublin in Ireland. And he says, I saw a speech recently on the BBC where we're losing the media war, Secretary Clinton said, mentioning specifically RT, Russia Today, as a propaganda channel run by Russia's Putin. Does Psyops extend to Western news media and now today's alternative internet, as far as you know?
Well, there's that old adage that we tend to, I think it was Ambrose Bierce in the Devil's Dictionary who said that, lies is their propaganda and the truth is our propaganda. So you always tend to take the interpretation of international events from your own trusted sources, and this goes right back to I can't overstress this enough, to these reality patterns that we have at the subconscious level.
Yes.
You have a set of standards in which you say this kind of information is trustworthy and good, and that kind of information is not. So when you say propaganda, you automatically say, well, they do it, but we don't. We give out good information on our news programs, and they give out lies and propaganda on theirs. So we say, here's Putin, for example, being lambasted in the media as being a thug and a murderer and a person who is attacking NATO and things like this. And I'm saying, well, excuse me, wait a minute. Don't we have a president right now who is conducting drone warfare and arbitrarily killing people in a variety of countries, with drones?
Speaking of drones,
and as far as the Russians, invading the Crimea and stuff,
yes.
Excuse me, but haven't we invaded a bunch of countries in the last several years? And as far as trying to influence the regime in whatever it is, the Ukraine, haven't we been involved in stuff called regime changing for some decades here? So. The pot's calling the kettle black here. It's just that we tend to sort of not count it if it comes from our side, but if they do it, it's bad. Remember that at the end of when we were busy sort of negotiating the implosion of the Soviet Union with Gorbachev, one of the promises we made is, well, NATO isn't going to go any further east. It's going to stay right where it is. And the other side sort of trusted us on that, and took Reagan's word for it. And where is NATO today? It's right up next to the Soviet Union.
That's right.
Or excuse me, right up next to Russia. So we don't
Former
tend to want to
Soviet Union.
mention that anymore, but that's what we did. And if you want to know why the Soviet Union gets so upset with countries having neo-Nazi governments right on its borders, all you have to look at its history. That's a country that's been invaded, from the Teutonic Knights through Napoleon, through World War I, and then World War II, and every time it's been just a horrifically savage invasion, and they're kind of fed up with it. They don't want nasty people on their borders anymore.
I don't blame them. And
Yeah.
I want to comment on something you mentioned. First of all, like you said, Barack Obama's no boots on the ground policy does not mean we're not at war, because when you have 18-year-old kids in Nevada flying drones over the Middle East or Crimea or wherever and dropping bombs and it looks like a video game, the disconnection that these kids are feeling is very different.
We're busy helping the Saudis out with their war in Yemen, which I heard from a national public radio today means that where a child is dying about every 10 minutes over there. The place is so horrendous. So you look at that and you look at these other areas there. The United States hasn't exactly got clean hands here. So if we're going to get moralistic, we have to apply these moral standards to both sides. There was a very famous movie that came out with the United States some years back called Judgment at Nuremberg, in which Spencer Tracy is an American judge judging some German accused war criminals in the dock there, wound up giving all these sanctimonious lectures about how the world couldn't put up with this kind of crap anymore. And, everything that he was denouncing in the movie is stuff that is just routine today. So it all comes in a circle. So I would say, physician, heal thyself. In other words, if you're going to get moralistic about other countries, you better look in your own underwear first and make sure that you haven't taken a poop there.
That's right, and I'm glad you mentioned calling the other, the pot calling the kettle black, because they're the same color. It's okay if we're doing it, but not okay if they're doing it. And this actually is gonna come full circle to your second book that we actually were gonna start on, was Mindstar, about subliminal messages. In the 70s, there was a law passed in the U.S. that forbid subconscious messages or subliminal messaging in theaters, because they did some tests where they would flash for a quick second, buy Coca-Cola and eat popcorn, and then at the intermission, people would run to the concession stand, and that's what they would do. They would buy it. And I think the percentage was drastically higher, so they ended up making a law saying it's illegal. But
that's a classic example of a very crude application of what I was telling you about earlier, in terms of the way that your sensory organs function at a subconscious level without your being aware of them. So you're seeing this stuff and you're processing it into reality that tells you, yes, I'm thirsty, and yes, I think a Coca-Cola would taste great. But you're consciously not thinking about that, because that 5% isn't picking up on it. So that's a very good example, a very crude one, but a very good example of that stuff at work. And what Mind War does is to take it far beyond that to your entire construction of reality, and to say that if you focus on all these psychons that are discussed in the book, you can straighten out a very large perception of reality and turn it good instead of bad and destructive. So that's the argument of the book. Mind War isn't a way that you attack somebody else with it. It's the way that everybody gets together and attacks an unstable situation. So it's a collective thing. There are no enemy, soldiers or human beings in Mind War that are targeted. It just cleans up everybody's head so that they can attack the current problem and resolve that constructively. So that's the design and function of the book. And that's also, as going back to that example that I gave before, that's the way that everybody stops World War II in 1940 in my novel We Break the Sword, in which not only Adolf Hitler and the Nazis and Mussolini and Stalin and Roosevelt and the rest of them meet and get together and work out a way to bring things to a nonviolent stop in 1940, but to actually cooperate in constructing a positive international situation after that. And it all sounds, you say
logical
to yourself, that sounds almost like an impossible kind of science fiction, but so help me, if you read it, if I read the novel myself these days, despite the fact that I wrote it, and I've had many other people say the same thing, it all sounds so damn logical and so damn simple. Why didn't we do it?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Anyway.
Well, before I get into Mindstar, speaking of the fact that these wars did happen and they're still happening, and you have, people forget to think about, or literally forget the fact that when a soldier goes out in Iraq, what they have is they have their guns, they have their bullets, they have their backpacks, their shoes, Coca-Cola, helicopters. Every single thing is covered under contracts. And then under George W. Bush, you had Halliburton, no bid contracts, right? So you have a multi-billion-dollar, hundreds of billions of dollars being spent, which goes back to what I was saying before the show, that when I was taking macroeconomic courses and the professor asked everybody, what is the best way to fix an economy of the world? And everyone had their own little solution, but the one answer was 3 letters, W-A-R, war. Can you explain why they would choose that path instead of the logical path that wouldn't cost so many lives and would make it easy for everybody? Easier, should I say?
Sure, because war, first of all, when you have a divided country, and there's that famous quote from Hermann Goering on this, which I quote in Mind War and has been quoted extensively elsewhere, where he said, it's very easy to unite a country. All you have to do is tell everybody that they're being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism, and then everybody gets together and does what they're told. It works the same in every country. So the strongest power that any kind of a centralized government has is its war power, its ability to monopolize the use of armed force.
Yes.
Everything else is kind of subordinate to that, and as long as it controls that power, then it can scare people and frighten people both inside and outside the country into unifying for those reasons that Hermann Goering said, that you're being told that you're being attacked, whether it's on 9/11 or Pearl Harbor or whatever else, and therefore we all have to get together and go beat them up. And anybody who disagrees is a traitor and a coward and needs to be locked up, or otherwise thrown out of things, So that's the primary function of any government, resides in its war powers. That was also echoed by a good friend of mine, Colonel Fletcher Prouty, when he was discussing the construct of government functions with Jim Garrison in the movie JFK.
That's right.
Colonel Prouty was the man called X in that movie, who was an advisor to Oliver Stone. Mm-hmm. And that was one of his, main principles. Colonel Prouty had been the head of black operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the early part of the Kennedy administration, so he knew whereof he spoke, and he'd been involved in special ops and black ops all the way back into World War II. And he was a close friend and student of what you might call the gray eminence, of Psyop Edward Lansdale, who was also briefly mentioned in that movie as General Y, and who Prouty said to me was the actual person who carried out the mechanisms of the JFK assassination. So, there's all kinds of interesting backstories there. But the point that we were, kind of getting at here is that, number one, any government's primary power is its war powers, its monopoly of armed force, and it uses that. It uses that to unify the country when nothing else will unify it. So if you can tell people that they need to be scared because somebody's attacking them, if either it's communism or after the East, came apart, now it's terrorism.
Yes.
Now anything that is bad is terrorist, and we have to go beat them up, even, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda or anybody else that's a terrorist, we have to go get them. And if you don't agree and you don't cooperate, then you're a bad person, and we're going to send you to Guantanamo.
Yeah, and which is absolutely the worst. That was formed, I believe, in the early 2000s. Well, Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo, the actual base, has been a naval base since, I think the 1890s or early 1900s in Cuba. But we didn't open the detention center until early 2000s because we had the pesky little laws of torturing or, the Eighth Amendment applying here on soil. So what's the better way to do it if you want to get around those laws? Get off the soil. Another option is the prison boats. I'm sure you've heard of those.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure. I haven't heard of prison boats per se, except that if you're talking back into the Revolutionary War, I know that the British had prison ships, that they anchored in the Hudson River at the time.
They still do.
Rather than take anybody back to Britain for justice, they just kept them on these prison ships here and dealt with them in the middle of a war climate. But yes, your rationale that you just cited for the creation of the Guantanamo facility is quite accurate, that it was designed to make sure that people didn't have constitutional rights to lawyers and to hearing in court, and things like the annoying little things like habeas corpus and so on. So it was a bad concept and a bad excuse, which Obama, of course, pledged that he was going to get rid of, the moment he came into office. And guess what? It's still here,
8 years later, in fact, literally, it'll be 8 years in January on 20th, so what does
Those are bad institutions, but it was George Orwell who, in 1984, very famously said, and it's quoted in Mind War, and it's been quoted extensively elsewhere, that the main function of war is to get rid of the excess production, the excess wealth of nations and citizens, to keep people in a state of want and in a state of deprivation and semi-starvation, so that they are more susceptible to being told to go out and fight in wars. So, because if you don't have wars that eat up all this excess production, then you've got more things to go around, and then you have happy people where everybody has more stuff, and they're generally content with what they've got, and they don't feel any reason to go out and attack anybody else. So you have to remove and destroy enough of that excess production around the world, whether it's food or it's refrigerators or living devices or anything else, or just wealth. You have to get rid of that so that people are in a state of want and semi-starvation, as he portrayed in 1984. And then you can keep people in a state of obedience through constant war. The big bugaboo in 1984 was that the world was in a state of perpetual war, and that's what we've got right now, very obviously.
What is your take on cognitive dissonance that seems to be happening to a lot of people in this day and age?
Yes.
Cognitive dissonance generally, I think, refers to not wanting to see a contrary argument to things. In other words, you're saying something to me that is heretical or that doesn't fit in my picture of reality, and therefore I'm just going to tune you out and not pay attention to you or not consider what you say. And that, once again, I sound like a broken record here. It goes right back into that business of superconscious pattern thinking, where you establish patterns of reality that you may not be consciously aware of, that select in and select out things that you pay attention to. And in a way, it's a good thing that civilian governments haven't been aware of the psychons in a way to really make good use of them. But there's been a lot of very crude attempts to control reality perception, which is, the propaganda that we've been discussing so far in this show that makes people sort of see reality through the official versions of stuff that they get from their government, so that if the United States government gives you an interpretation of 9/11, that's the truth and that's official. But if anybody gives you a version of it that doesn't wash with that, that's conspiracy theory, and therefore we're not supposed to believe it.
Like the Warren
Even
Commission.
if it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
the Warren Commission is another good case in point,
Yes. You know what the crazy part is now, a recent poll, I believe it was in 2010 or 2012, said that about 80% of Americans believe that Oswald was not the only shooter of JFK. So you have literally a whole generation go by for almost 40 years, or 38 years if it was 2010, that happened on November, was it 22nd, 1962?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
63,
Nonetheless, 63. Okay, the point being is that you have all these people at the time that took the word of the government, the Warren Commission, that said, hey, Oswald is the guy, and he's dead, and we imprisoned Jack Ruby, and so let's all forget about it, move on. Here's the next president, and here's the next war, and here's the next so on and so forth. But now you have so many more people digging into and dissecting the Warren Commission. I mean, there's been a handful of great guests that have been on the show that literally spend their careers in JFK and post JFK assassination discrepancies. What do you have to say about that and the Warren Commission?
Well, at the time, I was just in high school, of course, when Jack was assassinated, but I didn't really have I didn't spend a lot of personal attention on it for a long time, but as I said, my friend Fletcher Prouty, the retired Air Force colonel who had been working very closely as a protege and assistant to General Lansdale, told me some years later in considerable detail that it was a hit that was organized by Lansdale, who was basically working for the CIA at that time, and he went into considerable detail, how Lansdale did it. And Fletcher Prouty wasn't the type to invent this stuff. He was very matter of fact about it. And Lansdale, I discuss actually some of this in a chapter in Mind War that goes into it a little bit on Colonel X and General Y. But the significant thing of this, there was a point in there where Fletcher Prouty once said, and it was echoed by the actor, in the movie who played him. He said, the who and the how is just a parlor game. It keeps people guessing. It's scenery for the suckers. The real question is why. Why was Kennedy killed? Who benefited? Who had the power to cover it up? And those are the important questions. So it was basically a mechanism to resume the reactivating the war in Southeast Asia that Kennedy was trying to shut down. After that point, Kennedy got very scared after the Cuban Missile Crisis because we came very close, to getting into a World War III shootout with the Soviet Union at that time.
Wasn't that the closest ever? The only time the U.S. is...
Yeah, we were in a hair's breadth of launching on each other at that time, and both Kennedy and Khrushchev got very freaked out by that. They created, the direct communication, the famous red telephone, as it were, between Moscow and Washington. But also, Kennedy he changed American foreign policy to start de-escalating confrontations with the Soviet Union and with international communism generally at that time, rather than escalating them, which is not what the business interests in the United States and the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies wanted to see happen. So that's why Kennedy pretty much signed his own death warrant, when he did that.
It's sad that you talk about not you, the population talks about nuclear warfare and how close we came to it, but when you really visualize it and try to see the impact it would have had, it's not like, okay, you're decimating the enemy. No, you're destroying the entire planet. You're killing your home. Your children are going to die as well.
Well, I got news for you. Yeah. It's worse right now. Not one of those countries involved, either ourselves or the Soviet or Russia, has disarmed its nuclear arsenal since then. And if anything, the controls on them have deteriorated and are much looser. Yes. and less rigorous than they were back then. And when some people were saying to me, well, do you want somebody like Donald Trump in charge who wants to get more friendly with the Russians, or do you want somebody like Hillary who's going to defend us against them and be belligerent toward them? And I will say, well, you know what? Give me Trump, in a heartbeat, because we can't make a mistake here. You have somebody like Hillary trying to show that she has balls, even if she doesn't, and she's going to prove it by baiting the Russians. This is the wrong thing to do. You don't go up to an alligator and wave your hand in its mouth and say, I dare you to bite this, So if anybody makes a wrong move here, the planet is toast, and we don't have to wait for global warming. And right now, one of the most dangerous situations is actually in, and keep your eye on this, between India and Pakistan, both of whom are nuclear powers, and they're always in a state of semi-warfare over Kashmir. And all that has to happen is that somebody makes a stupid or wrong guess there, and if they have a nuclear exchange, it's very hard for that not to get quickly out of hand, and for the after effects of that to spread far beyond that area.
Yeah,
the other touch point is in the Korea. It's the same way.
Yeah,
you've got North Korea, and you've got nuclear weaponry that the United States controls in the south, and this is a very, very dangerous situation. We should not be baiting anybody who's got nuclear weapons, because if you fuck up and you push them over the line, you're not going to get a second chance. This isn't where you can back up and say, oops, and let's rethink this.
Exactly, especially like you said in the Koreas. North Korea, the Hermit Kingdom, as it's known, the young leader, what's his name? Kim Sung. Anyway, his name,
Mm-hmm.
the young, he's 28, something like, he's 30 years old or less. The point being is he's trying to make a point. If we bait him, what is he going to do? He's going to launch a missile and decimate us, and at the same time kill all the citizens, not care at all.
Well, you're risking, right next door. I mean, the thing about North Korea is it's right next door to Russia, and it's right next door to China. And both of those are very big nuclear powers. So if you get into a nuclear exchange with something like North Korea, you are very, very dangerously close to one of those big outfits. And if I were sitting in the White House, I'd say our policy towards North Korea is hands off. Let the Russians and the Chinese keep it on a short leash, because they're both going to do that.
That's right.
They don't want their countries to go down the drain because somebody in North Korea fucks up.
That's right.
So if you just leave them alone, they will keep that guy in North Korea on a short leash. They're right next door to him, and they can do that very easily.
And stop playing these war games with South Korea and the U.S. right near North Korea. Anyhow, Johnny Webb, London. Thank you for being up 4:30 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Go ahead, Johnny boy.
Not at all. Well, obviously, we've got a few people still asking lots of questions, and this one seems to be a familiar one. So I'll give it from Claudia in Lyon in France on Facebook. She asked, Dr. Aquino, is it plausible that the Nazi Jewish Holocaust could also be an international psyops?
The Holocaust. Well, first of all, let's again untangle this from the propaganda aspect and understand that at the time of World War II and pre-World War II, Jews were a subject of hatred and discrimination all over the world, not just in Germany. I mean, there were intense pogroms in places like Poland and Russia and many of the other Eastern European countries. Many countries like Britain and the United States had severe limitations on Jewish immigration, and they faced all kinds of discrimination. It was a lot politer in the USA, where we didn't necessarily go out and murder them, but we wouldn't let them into country clubs or buy property in polite neighborhoods. So there was an enormous amount of anti-Semitism, for whatever reasons you care to attribute that had come down over the centuries. And it was far from being a Germany-only thing. And in World War II, a lot of the countries that Germany was allied with, where it was Romania, Austria, and a lot of the other areas that it conquered, were only too happy to use the excuse to go after their own Jews and blame it on Germany. So nobody's saying. First of all, we have to understand that the Jews are quite right that World War II was a terrible time for them, but it was by no means something that can only be limited to Nazi Germany. But everybody else would like you to think that, right now, because it lets everybody else off the hook. And Germany isn't around. Nazi Germany isn't around to stand up for itself anymore, and everybody else has even criminalized in some countries the notion of being able to discuss the Holocaust except by these sort of traditional interpretations of it that say that this was a Germany only thing, but we won't. If you try to discuss it beyond that, we're going to put you in prison for even bringing that up and being a quote unquote Holocaust denier. No, nobody's denying anything. What the dirty thing, the dirty secret here is that a lot of people were involved in this, and it was by no means limited to just the Germans. So put yourself in the position of being a Jew, particularly after World War II, if you were one of the lucky ones to survive it, you're pretty damn scared.
That's right.
You're pretty damn paranoid. So if you have the ability and you have enough friends in the United Nations and elsewhere,
and money,
or in the United States, and they say, we're going to give you a country down in the Middle East that you can go to and set it up for yourself, and everybody will leave you alone down there. Well, your traditional enemies have all been in Europe. So you're going to go down there as fast as you can and create the nation of Israel. And if that means roughing up a few Palestinians who already happen to be there and are a little annoyed that you're taking their lands from them, that's just tough titty, because we're coming in, we're going to do this. So Israel today is a nation that's operating with a sense of intense national paranoia and fear out of its past history that says we have to protect ourselves here and ensure our survival, because if we don't, we're history. We're toast.
That's right.
And all you have to do is look at the history of the treatment of Jews for the last 2,000 years, and you appreciate why they feel so strong about this. It's a little bit like when I said earlier that Russia feels very strong about not having people on its borders that can invade it because it's suffered so badly. Well, suppose the United States had been invaded and massacred by Mexico, several times over the last 200 or 300 years. I guess we would have the same attitude, if we had an unfriendly Mexican government or a Canadian government,
Speaking
so
of
it's that,
the Russian borders, like you mentioned, didn't the Cuban Missile Crisis start? Khrushchev placed the nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba, all because of the fact that one day he was at the ocean, the Black Sea, and some general said to him, right across there in Turkey, where you could literally see the land, the U.S. has missiles. Why are they so close and pointing at us while we are so far away from them? Isn't that what happened?
This has to do with the doctrine that we had at the time, which was MAD, mutually assured destruction, which meant that if you had a balance between the United States and the Soviet Union with regard to nuclear strikes, then neither side would take the risk. And at that time, it was based on the notion that you were looking at U.S. ICBM missiles based in the United States and Soviet ICBM missiles based in Russia, which was generally about a half an hour warning time when they were launched. So half an hour doesn't sound like much time, but it's definitely enough time to get yours on the way back.
That's right.
However, so it generally worked as a concept. Neither side was going to take that risk of mutual destruction. But yes, when the United States introduced some Jupiter IRBMs, intermediate range missiles with nuclear warheads, into Turkey, then that reduced the warning time for their side to 5 minutes.
Really? I thought it was 12.
Yeah.
5 minutes?
Well, either way you look at it, it was pretty damn short.
5 or 12.
So
it's short. Yeah.
So the thinking by the Soviet Union was, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If they're going to do that, then we should do the same thing and put some in Cuba. Well, the United States threw a hissy fit because all of a sudden it wouldn't have retaliation time anymore. It wouldn't have that comfort zone of a half an hour. Yeah. And we were quite right to be upset about it because it destroyed that balance of terror, that mutually assured destruction concept where we were concerned. But with that same tunnel vision, that we've referred to earlier here, we only saw it from our side of things, and we didn't really see it from their side of things until somebody brought it up. Well, we've got Jupiter missiles in Turkey, which pissed off, Jack the haircut, and he said, "What the hell have we got that for? No wonder they're pissing us off."
Yes.
But then he was sort of stuck in a bind that said, well, if we trade our missiles in Turkey for their missiles in Cuba, it'll look like we're, giving into blackmail.
Yes.
And everybody will condemn me for it. So that's what he ultimately did, but they did it on a secret basis, which is brought out in Bobby Kennedy's book 13 Days and also in the movie 13 Days, where the United States sat down behind closed doors with the Soviets and said, if you take your missiles out of Cuba, we'll agree to take our Jupiters out of Turkey, but we're going to do it in 6 months, and it's going to be, we're not going to announce it, we're just going to do it. And if you say anything about it, we'll just deny that we have any agreement. And the Russians said, okay, that works for us. And they took their missiles out, and within 6 months, we quietly took our Jupiters out and restored the half an hour on both sides.
Really?
So that's the behind the scenes story of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
So essentially, the moment we get threatened, and this is 90 miles from Key West, our borders.
Yeah, that's a 5-minute warning to when the missiles arrive in Washington D.C.
Geez, yeah, and that would have literally decimated the entire eastern seaboard at that. It's just when you think of the insanity of that, it really just makes you wonder. But let me ask you this. Speaking of,
they had longer range missiles in Cuba that could have reached every city in the United States except for Seattle, Washington.
Really? So they could have hit L.A. if they wanted to?
Oh, yeah. No great loss there, but except for Disneyland. But other than that, yeah.
Yeah, and the Walk of Fame, right? If that. But anyhow, the question I had for you is, this goes back to human nature. Why is it going all the way back to the primitive time that man felt threatened enough that he had to kill the other? The earliest bones were found with spearheads in them. What do you think drives that subconsciously?
Well, in a sort of an early practical sense, if you have more people and limited resources, then there'll be a fight over the limited resources. Such as if there isn't enough mammoth meat to go around, then obviously the stronger will tend to take it from the weaker, so that you get fights like the one over the water hole at the beginning of 2001: A Space Odyssey, with the apes there. But this kind of bridges into the theme and the reason that I wrote Mindstar, which was the sort of companion book to Mind War. Mind War deals with with human thought construction on a kind of an external and environmentally driven basis, which is these processed thoughts that you get from your sensory organs of the world around you, and that both on a conscious and a subconscious basis you process into reality, and can be sort of crudely manipulated through propaganda. But there's a different kind of a thought that I, of course, ran into both in my research and in initiatory studies as well, which I referred to just in one paragraph in Mind War called conceptual thought. And this has to do with the notion of what most people sort of crudely refer to as the human soul, which is your character, your underlying value system of goodness and badness and how you come to that, your sense of dignity, your sense of identity, your sense of self-worth and of virtue, and all these wonderful kinds of terms. So in Mind Star, I set out to explore that and to categorize it and investigate it. And again, I went back to ancient Egypt, where they didn't have such a simplistic notion of the soul as this kind of a Judeo-Christianized one-size-fits-all thing. They actually compartmented the soul into 8 different aspects, which had to do with the most related to the physical universe to the most ethereal and disconnected from it. And I go into these in considerable detail from the original Egyptian sources in that book, and also, of course, go into the notion of how we relate the thing that is our soul, or as I preferred to restyle it, our mind star, because to me the word soul is too corrupted and too generalized, so I coined mind star to sort of supersede it. And my question was, well, how can we first understand and comprehend our own individual mind stars, and then after that, how do we relate this to externalized reality? Because this is kind of the Jiminy Cricket, in the movie Pinocchio, how the puppet was talking to Jiminy Cricket, and Jiminy Cricket said, well, I'm going to be your conscience, and I'm going to come along with you and tell you what's good and what's bad. And generally when Pinocchio followed the advice of Jiminy Cricket, he was in good shape, and when he ignored him, he got into trouble.
And he lied and grew a big nose.
Yeah, and donkey ears and the rest of it. In other words, he looked very much like most of our politicians today. So anyway, in the case of Mind Star, we get into you go back into again the days of the Egyptians and the Greeks, where you had a mechanical, unconscious, universe, what I've called the objective universe. What they referred to back in Greece is physis, sort of the physical universe. That's where we get that term physical from, physis, P-H-Y-S-I-S. That's the machinery, the mechanism. And then they had a guiding intelligence that was responsible for its construction and design in the first place, which is why it is as it is and what it is, which they called the Logos, L-O-G-O-S. So when you hear that term, in a precise sense, the physis and the Logos go together as parts of the whole, meaning the physis is the physical manifestation of the objective universe, and the Logos is the concept that puts it together. And it is the Logos that primitive people personify as God, when they are talking of that. But if they really chase it through and they come back to the concept of Logos, it's the this sort of universal pre-consciousness that dictates the laws of nature, the natural universe.
Logos,
because we see the universe is behaving according to natural law, so that a chair one minute stays a chair the next minute because of certain natural laws, and a table remains a table, and so on, because of these fixed laws of behavior of the way that atoms and molecules behave. Now the question is, why, do these things behave that way, and why aren't they just randomly changing all the time, like the chestnut tree, in Sartre's Nausea book, he's horrified because this obscenity exists when it really has no need to exist. He defies the concept of a Logos, and in his existentialism, he lives in a universe of pure physis, where all existence is a sort of an obscenity on non-existence, which is where you get the nausea, of the title. In any case, the Greeks, again translating from the ancient Egyptian, came up with nous, N-O-U-S, which is the ability of human intelligence to bridge the gap between the logos and the physis. And it is the nous, which you hear in such words as phenomenon and so on.
Yes.
It's the nous which enables us to make sense of both the physis and the logos if we want to put the effort to it. So again, Mindstar is a book that alerts you to this stuff and says, hey guys, this is the machinery and the processes that we're dealing with, and we got to get with it and understand it. We have to understand what comprises the Mindstar, all those 8 parts of your soul, and how they interact with the physis and the logos. And the result of this is something called telos, T-E-L-O-S, which is, again, kind of crudely translated as purpose. In other words, does humanity and higher consciousness of humanity, does it have a purpose? Do we have a higher purpose to why we're here and why we do what we do and we have the abilities we do? Or is this some big universal accident, that is completely random and has no meaning to it at all? Is there a meaning to us? Are we charged with some kind of higher virtue or purpose here? And the argument of Mindstar is we very definitely do have a higher calling and a higher purpose in our telos. And the book argues for that in extraordinary detail, which would probably cross the eyes of most of your listeners if we went into it here. I'm just telling you what the book does and where it goes. It takes all these things that people think of very vaguely by themselves and puts them under a lens and sharpens that lens to where it's razor sharp microscopically, and you can begin to look inside yourself and see what's there, who you are exactly, and why you do what you do, and then raise it to its highest level, which is something that the Egyptians referred to by the hieroglyphic term Kepher, which is one of the code words of the Temple of Set, and refers to coming into being as the God being that you have the potential to be, rather than as a mere stimulus response animal, the way Buckminster Fuller would like to see you.
That's right. Doug, he's an actual very famous fellow for what he created, especially that car that would turn sideways that never really made it into production, but he did make millions and other things. But quick question, and Johnny has a question. I just want to clarify one thing. When you say logos, because in modern Greek, logos means logic. Is that what you're referring to as far as ancient Greek?
Well, you have to kind of look at it the other way. Logic is a term that derives from logos.
Yes.
And it's sort of, again, a rather crude misuse of it, because logic means it's usually used to explain why there's a cause and effect relationship between things.
If not but
you're sort of reasoning out that.
Yeah.
But logos with a capital L is what I'm talking about, and this is the sort of super universal consciousness that orders the entire design of reality as it actually is. So that's the logos with a capital L. That's what I'm talking about. Logic with a small l is used by people to relate various things in the objective universe. In other words, if I drop this ball on the floor, that proves that there's gravity. Bonk. Okay,
correct.
That's logic.
Yes.
That's not the kind of logos that I'm talking about here. This is a 500-pound canary guy.
Or in law, it would be the but-for argument. But for this, there wouldn't be that. Anyhow, Johnny Webb. Go ahead, Johnny.
Well, this is coming from Facebook again, from Franco in Milan, and he's asking Dr. Aquino, with you being a former head of Psyops, he asks, was the previous or current and even the president-elect Donald Trump susceptible to any kind of MKUltra or Psyops while in the Oval Office that you can think of off the top of your head?
I'm not sure quite sure that I heard that. Could you repeat it again?
I'll say it as it's written. Franco in Milan asked Dr. Aquino, with your being the former head of Psyops, he asked, was previous or current and even President-elect Donald Trump, are they susceptible to any kind of MKUltra or Psyops while they're in the Oval Office? And he says that...
let me see if I can restate that. You're asking if Donald Trump would be susceptible to PSYOP when he's in the Oval Office.
Basically, yeah.
The short answer is yes. I mean, we all are if we allow ourselves to be stupid. and we allow ourselves to have our impressions and our sensory inputs uncontrolled and unexamined, which is exactly what Mind War and MindStar are saying you shouldn't do. You should be alert and aware to all these things and in control of them so that you know what's changing your mind, even if it isn't apparent to your conscious senses. You know what's coming in at the unconscious level, at the subconscious level, and you can guide that and control that in constructive ways. So it's only if you don't pay attention to these things and you say, this is bullshit, I don't pay attention to this. I'd love nothing better if I were a PSYOP professional and you hear somebody say, I don't believe in PSYOP, because then that tells me that I've got a real sucker here, and I can run them roughshod. I have often told people that if you want to understand how this stuff works, study stage magic and take some classes and learn to be a good stage magician, because at a very harmless level and an entertaining level, these people are in the business of constructing artificial realities for you and getting you to believe in them, so that you'll see a good stage magician doing stuff in front of your nose that you can't believe. And yet it's happening, and your senses are telling you that it's happening, and it's all because he knows more about what's going into your sensory perceptions than you do, and it's controlling them much faster and more expertly than you are. So one of my recommendations in Mind War was to tell Fort Bragg to get off its ass, and all your PSYOP officers, send them down to Hollywood and have them go through the long, instruction course down there at the Magic Castle, or in Britain of the Magic Circle that you've got over there, and learn to be good stage magicians, and then bring them back to Fort Bragg, for the rest of the stuff. But they need to know this up front first. One of the people that I worked with in constructing Mind War was the head of the PSYOP instruction system at Fort Bragg, Major Gregory Cease, who wrote the foreword to Mind War. And when he came out here to the West Coast to meet with me, I stuck him in a car and drove him down to Hollywood, and we spent an evening at the Magic Castle so that he could be absolutely stunned watching impossible things happen in front of his nose. And I said, well, there you go, Greg. I said, so this is what we need to get in the business of here, This is a very easy and a very harmless, but a very real example of how other people can control what you think is reality, and they can do it without a whole lot of effort, just by knowing a few simple things about the way that your senses function and how they can control them much better than you can.
What the eyes see and the ears hear, the mind perceives. And what, like you said about stage magic, once you find out what the solution to the trick is or how to perform it, you're like, huh? That's it? That's all it is? Yet, when you're on the other end, you're like, no, that's impossible. I can't.
I've been a member of the Magic Castle, for over a quarter of a century, and I know a lot of really good stage magicians, and I've studied the stuff myself, particularly in the areas of mentalism. And I recommend it to any listener here as being an absolutely wonderful and a very practical hobby to take up, because you learn an awful lot about the way human beings process ideas from being involved with it. At the same time, you can become very entertaining. The very first evening that I was at the Magic Castle back in the 70s, Uri Geller was making a big fuss, with his spoon bending stuff, and I mentioned to one of the senior magicians down there about that, and he said, bending metal is no big deal. And he said, you give me a quarter. So I took a quarter out of my pocket, and he held it in his hand and massaged it for a moment and then tossed it back to me, and it was bent 90 degrees. And I said, whoa! And I said, you just palmed that and switched one on me. And he said, I did not. I'll prove it to you. Give me your car keys. I said, I believe you.
Really? Speaking of Uri Geller, he's been on this show, and he's due back again. He sort of changed his mind once he was debunked by, I forget that other magician in Florida. James Randi.
Yeah.
On the Johnny Carson show in front of millions and millions of people. Johnny Carson was also a stage magician, and he was told by James, the Amazing Randy, that's what he was. The act was called, to consult on him before Uri came on, and to make sure that the props had a layer of glue underneath these little canisters. That way he couldn't tell which one had water or which did, or something like that. I don't recall exactly the details, but the point
There's a whole lot of this stuff. Yeah.
it was really crazy. Now, speaking of mentalism, can you give us a definition of what that is and what it entails, briefly?
Well, sure. This has to do with reading people's minds. That's the patter. In other words, what you're professing to do as a stage magician is to read people's minds and read their thoughts. And there are a variety of tricks that you can do to do this. Some of them require props set up. Others just have to do with the way you ask questions. For example, if I were, I don't know, just think of a European country, for example, whose name begins with D, and then take the last letter of that country's name, and think of an animal whose name begins with that letter. So now you're thinking of a country and an animal, and now take the last letter of that animal's name, and think of a fruit that begins with that letter. Okay, so now you're thinking of a country and an animal and a fruit, all of which you've been at complete freedom to think up by yourself. All I did was just ask you to think up these things. And then I would say, ooh, I'm getting these really weird vibrations here, Dr. J. I have a feeling you're thinking of a kangaroo eating an orange in Denmark.
Interesting. Very interesting. It's sort of like when you're doing card tricks and you have a force card, essentially, because you're giving the information, but it's like that movie, I don't know if many people have seen it, Law by Citizen. The point is every move that the prosecutor and the police and everybody, the mayor, everybody makes, thinks they're winning against this one prisoner, when in fact it's just another pawn being moved off the board. He's actually 2 moves ahead.
He's pre-narrowed down the decision.
Yeah, exactly. So
how many countries can you come up with in Europe that begin with the letter D? Then you get to the last letter of that, and you get to an animal.
Yeah.
And how many animals at the very quick of your tongue can you come up with whose names begin with a K?
1. Kangaroo.
And most people would immediately default to kangaroo. And then you get to O. Well, how many fruits can you come up with that begin with the letter O?
Orange.
Well, there aren't too many. There's orange.
That's right.
So then you say, oh, you're thinking of a kangaroo eating an orange in Denmark. Oh, wow. But actually you were constricted into that, from the moment I started asking questions, just by the way I framed them. You can pull that one on anybody and get a free drink at the bar next time.
I'm actually going to take advice on that. I'm going to try that on someone. Johnny, go ahead. What were you trying to say?
Yeah, sorry. As he was saying it, I was actually thinking Deutschland, dog, and grapes.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, you're getting too precise there. Most people wouldn't switch it into the national language. They would just think of Germany.
Yeah.
If you're asking the average American audience.
Well, I thought, Denmark. But then again, remember, we have 46 countries now listening, so that's pretty amazing. So, yeah, we have to differentiate that me and you are not just in the same country, but in the same state out of all 50. It's ironic. Let me ask you this. I know we're going to go a couple minutes over, but every single new, say, the U.S. Virgin Islands, it's a territory, not a state. But is that just because we don't want to seem overambitious to the world and say, oh, we're taking over something else? I mean, because what's going to happen when Raul Castro dies? Is Cuba going to become another territory of the U.S.?
Well, I don't think so. I think Cuba's pretty well set in its ways, as a revolutionary government on its own at this point. But the United States got a lot of these territories by just taking them over, but not pushing them to the extent of trying to turn them into states like it did Hawaii.
Yes.
And incidentally, there's a very nice, robust Hawaiian movement now from Native Hawaiians to kick us the hell out of their country, saying, you conquered us and overthrew Liliuokalani, by armed force, and we want our country back, so get the hell out.
Right. The king, yeah.
So, some of this stuff goes around and comes around. And you see some of these countries that are suddenly feeling independently oriented, including the ones in the Mideast where people say, geez, how come all these Kurds are behaving so strangely, when they should be behaving like Iraqis, or they should be behaving like Syrians or whatever? Well, they don't consider themselves Iraqis or Syrians. They consider themselves Kurds.
Kurds, yes.
Including the ones who are in Turkey, so they want their own Kurdistan, and here in the West we can't understand. But that's not in the rules, that's not how we set up these countries at the end of World War I or whatever. Well, nobody asked the Kurds back then, did they? The Ottoman Empire came apart, and Britain and France sat down and parceled out all these artificial countries that we're stuck with today that in some cases bear very little relation to reality there, which is why we're in some of the jams that we're in there.
That's right. You have all these different cultures that don't identify with the country, but identify with their tribe, like you said, the Kurds or the Sunnis, right? They don't want to be part of Iraq, or maybe it's not the Sunnis. It's the point being is they don't identify with Iraq. Now, here's a question I wanted to ask earlier. What about ISIS? Before we go, how would you use Mind War and its companion Mind Star to conquer ISIS when you have people whose parents were killed in the Soviet versus Afghanistan in the 80s for 8 years, and 80 to 88 was the campaign, I believe, when the final Soviet tank left the bridge back into the Soviet Union.
Well, ISIS didn't exist back then. ISIS is a creation of the post-American invasion of Iraq, and what happened is that Saddam Hussein had a government that was secular. It didn't really discriminate actively between the Shia and the Sunni branches of Islam. It contained both, but it was on the whole it was more strongly on the minority side, which was the Sunni. So when the United States came in there, it dismantled the old Hussein government and instituted its new one. And since the old one had happened to be mostly Sunni, it said, well, let's make the new one mostly Shia. So the government, that we've instituted down there in Baghdad is basically a Shia government, which is really smart. One of our better foreign policy, thumbs up your ass, because of course what existed beforehand was a sort of a balancing act in the Mideast there between Iraq and Iran, where they each countered each other, and we destroyed the ability of Iraq to be a counterforce to Iran there. And while we were at it, we constructed a government that's Shiite, which is very closely allied to that of Iran. So if we were going to construct a puppet government for Iran, we did a great job of it. So you had a lot of people left over in Iraq who were Sunnis, and the new government started to persecute them very badly with summary executions and stealing their stuff and basically being rough on them for the better part of 10 years after the invasion. And they all came together and formed a new government and a new state, which they called ISIS. And they called it the Islamic State because they specifically wanted to create a state out of it. And they wanted to create a sort of a Sunni state that was made up of people who agreed with them in Syria and in Iraq, which is why it had that ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, in its nickname there.
ISIL,
so that was sure. So well, the L got added for Libya, later on. But
Dr.
the point is that these guys formed ISIS because they were tired of being kicked around by the puppet government down there in Baghdad, and they wanted their own country. And this was against the laws. You don't just get to create a country anymore unless the old imperial powers said you could. So and obviously none of the imperial powers gave their permission to ISIS to create itself. So suddenly it became a pariah. And ISIS was not attacking the United States, and it wasn't really attacking anybody outside of the territories that it wanted to incorporate in itself. It wanted to create a country for itself and its own people. But everybody else started attacking it, which made it attack back. So now ISIS is branched out to being a kind of an actual international terrorism thing, whereby it sponsors attacks in other countries that are attacking it, which isn't too illogical when you think about it. If somebody attacks you, then you attack them back. If it were up to me, I would have let ISIS have their own little country there as long as they left everybody else alone and just concentrated, on running their own country and taxing their own people and that kind of thing. If that's what they wanted, I would just let them have it. And if that meant that Iraq lost some territory and Syria lost some territory, then that was territory that had been artificially created, several decades ago at the end of World War I, which might just as soon be resectionalized now in much the same way that Israel, was created out of somebody else's property too. So I would have done that, and then I don't think we would be having any problem with ISIS today, except as it would be one more country in the Mideast that was kind of running, playing to its own violin, a little bit like, places like Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Bahrain or things like that. So that doesn't mean we would necessarily like it, but it wouldn't be attacking the United States. That's what I would do with it. I would have left it alone.
Johnny's got a question. I got something to add to that. Go ahead, Johnny.
A few years ago, Dr. Aquino, I saw a CBS interview with some members of the Israeli government, and it was back in the sort of 80s, and they were asking their Mossad gentleman, the intelligence agency, what name should they call them as other countries call their secret governments or military governments like MI5. And they said, well, call us ISIS, the Secret Israeli Intelligence Service. Is this Orwellian doublespeak?
Well, I think it's probably just a coincidence. I mean, there's an intelligence service over in Pakistan, I think, which is also ISI. That's their intelligence service. So when you get the letters IS, for intelligence service, then it's pretty easy to come up with a lot of names that sound very close together. Except in Britain, of course, where you have the MIs. And you have the MI5 for domestic and MI6, for foreign. And in places like Russia where you have, or in the Soviet Union where you had the KGB, which was the Committee for State Security, which had a fancier name like that.
Which
and
is
of course, we have
FSB.
all sorts of names over here.
Yeah, that's right. We do. CIA, DIA, DOD. Mm-hmm. There's so many alphabet soup agencies that I don't think any civilian can even comprehend the amount of them. There's TSA, DEA,
So I wouldn't worry too much about initials as being significant as something, automatically sinister, because they're all pretty close together.
That's right. Let me ask you this. We had, of course, the Taliban fighters. Then we had Al-Qaeda to contend with. Then it just seems on the news one day, no more mention of Al-Qaeda, and ISIS pops up. Is it just a name change, or is it literally a whole separate group of people because...
largely a different group of people. Largely a different group of people because Al-Qaeda was internationalist. It was, in fact, designed to promote international terrorism, to go out, into the Western infidel countries and kick their ass for the way that they were collectively mistreating the Islamic world. So Al-Qaeda did not focus on creating a country for itself, but ISIS was very definitely the other thing. ISIS was not internationalist. It didn't go out and try to mess with other people's stuff. It just wanted to create a country for itself. And it's only after the Western nations began to gang up on it and say, we won't let you do that it has become more international terrorism oriented, because that's the only course of action left to it. If we, all these people aren't going to disappear. If we completely crushed all the territory that ISIS has for itself in Iraq or Syria today, if we occupied all of it and basically made all these people run out of it, where do you think they're going to go? They're going to go into all these Western countries that made life impossible for it, and they're going to get even. And then you're going to see a sort of a super Al-Qaeda as a result, which is my other reason for saying what we should have done at ISIS is leave it alone, let all these people have their own little country and let them pay attention to it and themselves, and their wives and kids, and taxing their own people and trying to make money off trade, with the West and so on, and let them do that. Leave them alone, but don't try to exterminate them, because if you try and exterminate them, you'll just make them spread out and they'll all have vengeance in mind, and you'll create a sort of a super Al-Qaeda.
But doesn't this sort of stem? Does this sort of stem, Dr. Aquino, from people like Zabrynsky back in the 70s, who was working with what we haven't talked about was the Taliban, in them days the Mujahideen, and even with like movies like James Bond movies that were sort of emulating sort of the Mujahideen and this sort of what would have been like a Ben Laden type character in the movie, being aided again by British intelligence,
In the third Rambo movie, we had these macho Rambo movies over here with Sylvester Stallone, and in the third one, he was actually fighting on the side of the Mujahideen against the Russians, over in Afghanistan. So the third Rambo movie is kind of out of step with how we like to interpret these people later, because he was fighting on the same side of the same people who later turned into Al-Qaeda.
But again, I ask, with Zina Zabrynsky that was setting up this Al-Qaeda connection with America, with sort of in a proxy type sort of understanding, where did that turn and go bad? Where today, like the name that we use today, ISIS or ISIL, have spread out from Mujahideen, from the Taliban into these sort of regimes.
I don't see a direct connection between ISIS and Al-Qaeda or the Mujahideen. I do see a connection between the Mujahideen and Al-Qaeda, because Mujahideen sort of evolved into Al-Qaeda, that's all.
My connection comes from Zina Zabrynsky's own book called The Chess Game. Sorry to interrupt you there. My connection came from Zina Zabrynsky's book called The Chess Game, I believe it was called, where he was talking about connecting with the Taliban and Mujahideen. It brings us up to the J.P. Morrow building in Oklahoma, right up to today. Really, it's quite an interesting sort of read. But that was my connection towards that.
Yeah, I haven't read his book, and I actually haven't made that close a study of Brzezinski. I'm not even sure how to spell his name unless I look it up in the dictionary. So it was interesting when Obama came to power.
It was interesting when Obama came to power in Berlin, of all places. Was given the sort of the limelight. He mentioned vigorously his support. Thank you for Zina Zabrynsky.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said, I'm not too familiar with his ideas, except that obviously if he's writing a book today, he has the advantage of 20/20 hindsight and can look back on things and say, well, this is what we did because we knew this was going to happen, when at the time they were all fumbling around in the sandbox, like anybody else, and they didn't know where this was going to go. So if we did help create the Mujahideen and funded them and gave them weapons at the time because they were being nasty to the Soviet Union, I don't think anybody said, well, we better watch out, because once they kick the Soviet Union out, they may turn around and redirect the stuff towards us. So obviously, if we'd been paying attention and had thought that, then we might not have been quite so quick to arm and train these guys as well as we did.
Speaking of the Soviet Union, you have Putin in there, former KGB, and he's maintained power for a long time, obviously. First of all, he was a colonel in the KGB when the Soviet Union collapsed, and then he became president. Then he let Dmitry Medvedev become president when he was prime minister, then back to president, and now, according to their own constitution, he can remain president, I believe, till 2024. And I have a feeling Putin will not leave that office unless feet first. Now that he's got it. And on top of that, in Forbes magazine, he's listed in the top 10. A friend told me that. I didn't believe it, so I looked it up. They say $40 billion, but then when you read it, it says it's $40 billion, but however, Forbes estimates his assets could actually be over $200 billion because of the underestimation of some of the value of the properties and so on and so forth, and things we don't even know about, which would make him almost 3 times richer than the richest man that we know of, which is Bill Gates. So that's a pretty scary thing. You got the richest man owning a country and having these nukes, and of course being in power longer than any U.S. president will ever be.
Well, in the most exalted throne in the world, as Henry Fonda observed in Harm's Way when he was playing Admiral Nimitz, he said, "We are seated on nothing more than our own ass." And Vladimir Putin may nominally control all this stuff and have all this wealth, but he's in power because he's the strongman of Russia, or AKA the Soviet Union or whatever evolved. Russia has always been a strongman country, whether it's the Tsars or whether it's been Stalin or Khrushchev. There's always, some guy who's in the driver's seat, and that's kind of the way the country functions the best. But it's actually a very tenuous job to have, because you can be kicked out of power very easily by the cabal that's supporting you, and it doesn't matter how much money you've got. It just depends on how tight a control you have of things. And right now, Putin seems to be as tight in control of Russia as Stalin was. And Stalin, of course, lasted his whole life, but others like Khrushchev didn't. So Russia is Russia. You can be in control of everything one minute, and the next moment you're either retired on the Black Sea or you're toast.
That's right.
So
that's right.
That's the way that country is.
And I heard Putin came to power because he made promises to Boris Yeltsin and his family to keep them alive and out of prison. And who can make that, such promises to Putin and his family now? I don't think anybody, which is why I think, like you said, you're either, president or have power for a long time, or one day you're in it and next day you're out. So that's at least my take on that. But
when the Soviet Union collapsed, the whole idea in the West was, okay, they're going to become a good little capitalist republic.
Yeah.
But the West paid no attention to trying to help them do that. We just left them alone and figured they'd figure it out for themselves. And what we got was a kind of an Al Capone version of it. And that's because we, didn't pay attention to it, and we let all the Russian strongmen fight it out amongst themselves, and that's what we got.
Yes, agreed. Johnny, what were you trying to say? Go ahead,
Yeah,
Johnny.
well, I think back to, because obviously I look at the mainstream media, and I also look at alternative media, and obviously we get a vast amount of information and pictures and understandings. And what brought to mind was, I think it was the Crawford Ranch meeting, where you had Putin and you had the former President Bush, and alongside him was Berlusconi and Tony Blair. And they came out of the building and walked along this lawn, and they all had these coats on that looked like magicians' coats. And it was like a right club, And to me, I wondered if the international stage is not a big sort of stage as what it is. They're actually the international cabal, or, the Illuminati crowd, or the few that control the many. This is sort of what people sort of say to me online. They're asking questions like this about the few that control the many. Is it a big club? Are they really all in it together?
Well, I think that each country still has a perception that it's sovereign and that it controls its own war machinery, which, as I said, is the definitive function of a government these days. And so it's going to be in a kind of a very wary balance with others. And anybody who tries to upset that balance, particularly among the major countries, is asking for trouble with the others, which is, as I said, one of the reasons why I think Hillary, got into trouble, because she kept making all these belligerent statements about confrontation with Russia, which was a stupid thing to do with a country that has all these 90% of the non-U.S. nuclear missiles, on its territory.
Correct.
So that's a kind of a stupid way to behave. So yes, these people all have to behave in a reasonably mutually careful way. I mean, it's no different than the conferences that we had at places like Potsdam and Yalta and things towards the end of World War II, trying to figure out how they were going to organize the world, post-Nazi, post-fascism, and so on. And I would say that I don't think they're necessarily being all in on the same in the same conspiracy together, but I think that they all respect one another's conspiracies, so to speak, and they have a kind of a delicate balance, which nobody's going to upset if they've got any brains. That's the way I would look at it.
Let me ask you a question, since we've already gone a little over and we're going to and start to wrap here. Now, the fact that Mind War, I know for a fact, like I said, I personally placed it into the hands of Michael Dukakis, who ran against George Herbert Walker Bush, Daddy Bush, in 1988 and lost. He won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. And then, of course, the Honorable Paul Hellyer from Canada and Nick Pope in UK. You mentioned that Mind War is in the hands of Donald Trump. How do you think he will act with having that knowledge and the fact that he's gone out and made statements that he's going to become friends with Putin as opposed to make enemies?
Well, I don't think that I haven't seen any signs that he's actualizing the prescriptions of Mind War in what we've seen so far. But remember, he isn't even in office yet. All we're seeing is preliminary rumors and indications. And all I'm saying is that Mind War was designed to plant an idea that there is an alternative to the old blood and guts way of thinking in the minds of people who do have some power to push on it. Even if Donald Trump were a firm believer in Mind War, he's got a huge amount of inertia in the military-industrial complex that he would have to push against to try to implement it. So I don't expect, for example, to see Mind War take over international relations in my lifetime, but I think that somebody had to start somewhere, and I'm glad that I at least, lit a spark here, and I think it's a good spark. I think there's substance to it. I think it's going to do nothing but get more influential as time passes, and it could very well stand ultimately in between the human race and its self-annihilation, because if we just leave things in physical war mode the way we are right now, sooner or later we're going to wind up with biting off more than we can chew. Somebody's going to light off one of those damn nuclear weapons, and we're all going to be in the soup. So Mind War is not just a pleasant hypothesis. Mind War is saying we don't have a whole lot of time left, people. You better start wising up, and you better start getting intelligent about this stuff, because if you just keep going like you are, you're going to run out of time, and you're going to run out of options, and we're going to lose the whole game for everybody.
Well, it reminds me of the Rosie Cranston statue there called the Georgia Guidestones, where, the very first statement says that we must keep the humanity under perpetual balance with nature of 100 million people. And that's, if there's 6 billion, that's quite a few that's got to disappear.
Yeah. We got an awful lot of people here. And if I were the world dictator, I would also, tell people slow down on the breeding, until we can feed everybody that's here right now. Stop. China had the right idea when they were trying to limit family size, but of course it was an uphill fight because people like to have sex, and when you have sex, then you get more people. So it's like a planet full of rabbits here, that humanity is vastly overrunning, the ability of the planet to support it and all the other species. And if you're a conservationist, you're well aware that an enormous amount of the world's natural resources are just dying out, including other animal species and, coral reefs and the ability of the oceans to survive and things like this. We're just wrecking the whole thing because there are too damn many of us, and we should, if you'll pardon my vulgarity, just stop fucking people. All right,
I don't know.
Or
I have to because I think
slow down anyway. Because it's way out of balance with what the world can support. For centuries and centuries, there was plenty of world to go around, and still enough room for people to behave like rabbits. But we're way past that point now. We've got to knock this off.
And like you said, people literally have to slow down in the fact that, because if you look at the population right now, think about the rate that it has grown in the last, say, 30 years. What's going to happen 30 years from now? All these people who are in their teens or tweens or toddlers are going to be adults. And then they're going to be getting together and having children. So you're going to have a population boom beyond belief. But then you also have the argument that every single American can fit in the state of Utah. which at the same time, that doesn't give you any of the resources. And one more thing I'd like to add. This was publicly announced, I read on the news the other day, that giraffes are starting to slowly go into extinction. So that's more proof that we are causing harm to the planet. And remember, everybody, the planet is not just ours, humans. It belongs to every living thing on it. So everything, what is there? How many?
I heard another estimate the other day that had to do with the rise of the ocean's level as a function of the faster melting of the Antarctic glaciers and so on, that says that after a while you're going to have about 10 million people in the nation of Bangladesh, which is already at sea level, trying to go someplace else so they don't drown. And that's going to make the present refugee crisis in the world look like a drop in the bucket. What are you going to do with 10 million people who are all trying to move someplace else?
But if that's the case, Dr.
That's the situation in which we're moving here. Yeah.
At the same time, you also have, like you said, if the sea level rises because of the melting of the Arctic and Antarctic ice, then you also have islands disappearing, or like you said, Bangladesh at sea level,
or London or New York.
Johnny, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I was just interluding to say that if that's the case from Bangladesh, being decimated, then places like London or Manhattan, we would be in the same threat zone if it rose 18 feet,
Exactly. Geez, I was in London a couple of weeks ago for an eye operation on my left eye at the London Eye Hospital, and while I was there, I was wandering around the streets of London, and I was saying, good Lord, there's an enormous amount of people here. Everybody's jammed together. The traffic is bumper to bumper. There's no place to park anything anywhere. And it's just one big, overwhelming, crowded city. It's scary.
Very diverse as well. We have a big Islamic community, Indian, Bangladesh, you name the country, and they've got a restaurant here.
That's right.
When I was a 12-year-old kid, my mother took me to London for the first time, and everybody over there behaved like they were John Steed and Emma Peel out of the Avengers. And you're quite right that if you go there today, you can't find John Steed and Emma Peel anymore.
Yeah, it's very diverse today. That's right. A lot of friends say to me, I came to London, but I couldn't find any English people.
Dr. Aquino, let me ask you this as we wind down. Speaking of this overpopulation and living like rats, think of our UCSB, where we went to school. Isla Vista. You have 25,000 people plus in 1 square mile. I was never able to park unless I paid for parking in one of the apartments. You could only walk or ride your bike, and that's pretty much the only way you have access inside that area. And
that's weird, because when I was an undergraduate there in the 1960s, it was a desert in Isla Vista. There was almost nothing built up there. And the campus itself was just a bunch of old World War II Marine Corps Quonset huts, that people were teaching classes in. So the place today looks like Disneyland on steroids. It's scary.
So does Santa Cruz. Yeah, Santa Cruz is the same thing. Now, let's do some plugs. Of course, unless there's any other topic we missed, which we will get to next time, because next time I do want to talk about the higher purpose that will blow our listeners away, because like I said, we have a very diverse range of topics on the show with a large, diverse guest list, I guess you could say. We've had Jesse Ventura, which I thought he was going to come on and talk about being a governor, but instead he comes on and talk about Jesse Ventura's marijuana manifesto. So, nonetheless, you never know where things are going to go. But the point being is, I know what I got out of Mind War and Mindstar. And for everybody out there, remember, drjradiolive.com. Click on books and videos. Scroll down to Michael Aquino. Click on his name, and it'll take you straight to his Amazon authors page, where you could find both of these books. And like Dr. Aquino said, you will see the updated version, which I have the older version of Mind War. And again, like he also mentioned, the Kindle version, the ebook, which is also...
Sure. And also We Break the Sword is there, and the Morlandale, which is my own interesting, you might say, commentary or exploration of the Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
And also something called Fire Force, which is, you might say, a mind war kind of takeoff on Star Wars. So there's all kinds of fun stuff there.
Yeah, you have actually even more. You have 2 books on the Temple of Set, right? If I'm
sure. If you're curious about the Church of Satan and the Temple of Set, there are books there that go into them in more detail than you ever wanted to know.
Yes. Now, real quick, I want to, of course, make the plugs. The networks: Pulse Talk Radio Network, Deprogram Radio Network, thanks to Johnny Webb in London. And thank you, Johnny, for staying up so late to do the show. And, of course, those networks and those people who are awake this early and further east. I'm talking about west of the dateline, that people, it's day already, that are listening. Some people, such as Jaffe in South Korea, if you're out there listening, well, this one is for you. We also have PSN Radio, and of course, Late Night in the Midlands, based in Indiana, and our very own Coast to Coast PM radio network, not to mention terrestrial radio near you in the Midwest and East Coast of the United States. TuneIn.com, Shoutcast, and iTunes. Those are a lot of ways for you to listen, not to mention YouTube, and keep a watch for shows to be archived there with some cool images, which you'll get to see the show and all of Dr. Aquino's shows that have ever been here. Not to mention that very historic show with Dr. Aquino and Peter Lavenda. That was something that people are still talking about to this day. And now I do want to also mention all the little sites you can go to. Remember, everything is under the same name. The name of the show, Dr. J Radio Live, DRJ Radio Live. So the website, Instagram, Twitter, Slack, Facebook, Minds.com, MINDS, Minds.com. Everything that I know, there's at least 10 different social media outlets with the same name. So I want to thank, of course, my team members. We got Johnny Webb, who literally stays awake so late to do this, and so early. I want to thank him and his family. And, of course, I do want to thank our guest, Dr. Aquino. You have been fabulous as always. I can never get enough of speaking to you, and I know the listeners can't because they always request you. So we definitely have to get you on the air again. And
well, thank you, Johnny, also for your wonderful conversation and fascinating questions. And, of course, thanks to you, Dr. J, for making all this happen.
Absolutely. Thank you. And
it's really my honor. Your honor. Sorry, I'm honored to be on.
Honor. Exactly. And the most important people we want to thank are the listeners worldwide. If it wasn't for you guys and gals listening, asking questions, writing comments, and registering on the site, which is everything's for free, by the way. We don't charge for anything because we believe in just giving things away for free. Knowledge is power, and what you're getting is knowledge right now. So, with that being said, I want to leave it to Dr. Aquino to plug in the 2 books again, why everyone should get them, because I already said the reasons why I got them and what I got out of them, not to mention several other books I have of Dr. Aquino's. And, Dr. Aquino, if I could, can I get a final statement from you to everybody around the world, from the 46 countries that have at least participated in one way or another, not to mention all the countries that I have no clue that may be listening but have yet to either register or write in or call or something, because most of the questions, because it's an international show, come in through one of the 30 plus Facebook pages and of course Twitter and all these other things. So that's how I was able to count all those, but I don't know. Everyone who has internet access has access to this, and that's why I don't know really how many there are beyond 46. Hopefully.
Well, shortly before his assassination, John Kennedy was talking at the American University, and he said, among other things, he said, "What kind of peace is it that I seek? It's not a Pax Americana. It's one in which we all cooperate together. He said, we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we're all mortal. So his message there was, we're all in the same bucket here, people. You know, we can't get partisan. We can't afford to be nationalistic. We can't afford to find artificial dividing things. We all have to look at this as human beings and figure out how we can understand ourselves and improve ourselves and cooperate. And that's the overall message of both Mind War and Mind Star. One is on the Mind War is on a kind of a mass level as you're looking outward with groups of people that you interact with, and Mind Star is looking inward towards your own soul so that you can understand it and perfect it. And that's the bottom line of both books, and they are supposed to not dictate how you should think or behave. They're supposed to light a fire under your ass so that you start thinking about these things in a positive way.
I love how you're so blunt because it wakes people up in every way. And one thing I really, really love about all your books, especially Mind War and Mind Star, is every single chapter starts with a quote from somebody famous in either present history or even antiquity. So if aside from one more message, since you covered the books, can you give us one more awesome quote and what else you would like to say? Pick a nice quote.
Whoa, I don't have the books open to me, but I'll just reference that the very first thing that you run into in the when you open the front cover of Mind War is a 5-star flag, which is the flag of Dwight Eisenhower when he was a 5-star general at the end of World War II, which is the equivalent of field marshal for other countries, where he was stating very strongly that with his experience as the supreme commander in World War II, we simply cannot afford to build more missiles, build more guns, because every missile built, every gun constructed, every bullet made just means food ripped away from some child's mouth who's starving, and brings humanity closer to just hanging on a cross of iron. So that was his message, which predated his famous one about the military-industrial complex, but just goes to show that you can be a 5-star general and you can see this stuff as clear as a bell and tell everybody, look, this is the wrong track and we've got to get on the right one, and we don't have a whole lot of time.
Agreed. Well said. Hang tight real quick, Dr. Aquino. To everybody, I hope you've had a fabulous time. And as always, check out the website for more. And, of course, you will see us with more guests, more politicians, celebrities, and researchers of every kind. With that being said, this is Dr. J, and I am officially signing off.